Hey, it's Jessica DaMassa with WTF Health. I'm here at Frontiers Health, and joining me right now in the studio, I have Polina Hanin. She is the Academy Director at Startup Health. So welcome. It's so good to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Thanks. So, Startup Health is probably one of the better known startup accelerators,
Yeah.
and I don't even know what to call you guys anymore. You're a portfolio of like so many. You're a movement, the moonshot thinking, the whole deal. So it's great to see you here.
Thank you.
In Berlin. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the trends that you're seeing. We're here in the digital health heart of Europe, right, at Frontiers Health. And so what are some of the differences between what you're seeing and what you guys have here going on in Europe with the startups here versus at other parts of the world? You guys are global, and so each little pocket seems to have an area of expertise. So what are you seeing here in Europe?
It's a great question. And Startup Health is really a platform that organizes, supports, and invests in a global army of what we call health transformers, right? to achieve 10 health moonshots. So all of these moonshots are global in nature. They're things like access to care and driving costs to zero and curing the disease. And those moonshots are important because they're meant to address problems that all of us have, that over 1 billion people in the world may be experiencing. So you have to be global in nature when you have such demanding challenges within health and wellness as a whole. So we've always taken a global approach to innovation, and out of the 257 companies that we currently have as part of this global army, about 20% are outside of the United States, which is wonderful because you get a chance to see as to what works in other markets and what's working and what's not working, what are some of the things that are truly universal, and what needs to have a localized context. And that's one of the things that I've really enjoyed about Frontiers, is that you get that perspective. And so one of the biggest differences that we're seeing with the companies that are based outside of the United States is the partnership opportunities with insurance companies and with the government. So you actually get companies that are rolled out countrywide, and their platforms are rolled out countrywide to be preventative or to actually treat certain diseases and certain challenges that you just don't have in the United States. Because you have to strike every single individual relationship one at a time in the U.S. And the universal nature of healthcare in some of the countries within Europe has been wonderful.
Do you think that sets those startups up for an advantage? So I just spoke actually a few moments ago with the COO of MySugar, which got acquired by Roche. And so it's like, is a startup like that at an advantage because they can roll out countrywide to at least get started and maybe land a bigger deal with a bigger player?
Yeah, so I think it depends also on where you want to go. Right. So
fair enough.
So, but they are to a certain extent, particularly when you're gathering data of your impact, because you're being rolled out to a larger population pool, because you have access to additional resources that you may not necessarily have otherwise, additional partnership opportunities. You can gather so much data about your impact to then be able to parlay it to either other indications or to be able to strike up additional partnerships down the road. Now, the question comes into play as to whether, if you do want to go into the U.S. market, gathering the right data at the right time that is going to be important for an insurance company or a hospital system or a pharmaceutical company in the U.S. is going to be critical today.
With the 20% of the companies that you guys have in your army, because I can't even call it a portfolio now. I just have to call it an army. Within the army, the 20% that are not based in the U.S., I'm sure they've got their eye on coming into the U.S. Right? So how do you help them, I guess, bridge that gap? And are there certain things that you would advise startups that are not U.S. based, that are looking to get into the U.S. to like put on their checklist of things to do? So give us some good advice for these guys that are watching.
Absolutely. So the first thing to do is, if you know that you are going to be selling to a certain stakeholder in the U.S., start to talk to that stakeholder type early and understand what kind of data, what kind of information is going to be impactful for that stakeholder. Because the things that may be impactful for one geographical region may not necessarily translate depending on how the business models are, what the incentive structures are like. So talking to those stakeholders early is going to be really important. Because the last thing that you want to do is lose an opportunity to gather data. For instance, if you've been rolled out countrywide or throughout a particular region, you should be gathering the data that is going to set you up for the future.
Right.
And that's actually a really good practice for any entrepreneur that is thinking about going into additional business models or launching additional products. Kind of having that eye on the future, so where you'll need to get to, so that you start to prepare for it today, is going to be fairly important.
Very critical. Is there anything that those startups seem to like over and over again when you guys look at either a pitch deck or you guys look at their business model, you're like, oh, forgot it again. So like, is there anything like that it's just almost like we take it for granted, maybe like the U.S. startups, just because we've been born and bred in our own environment and it's more consumer based and we're used to dealing with multiple parties in the health system. Yeah. But when you're coming from abroad and you're trying to make sense of, I don't want to call it a mess, but the system over there. Is there anything that they always, or not always, but that seems very common that's left out?
Yeah, it's actually that data component.
The data component.
Yeah,
okay.
so I think that a lot of entrepreneurs take for granted how quickly you can strike a deal, or not quickly, whatever the syntax is that I'm messing up right now. So because you need to have a relationship with so many different stakeholders, like you're not just selling to one insurance company, right? You're selling to a disparate set, ones that look for disparate things. Same thing with hospital systems and different providers. You just have a completely different business model in the US than you do outside of the US. So going into an insurance provider with a case study that you think works, it just can't be implemented in the US because you need certain other approvals that you need to go through. So when we talk to a lot of the entrepreneurs that are based outside of the US, or trying to get into the US, tell them to consistently remember exactly how that flow of money works.
Okay.
So you need to understand who pays whom, when they pay, and why they pay.
Okay.
And so it is being able to sell into that willingness to pay, rather than just being not paternalistic about it, but saying it's like you should implement this technology because it does generate results. In the US, it's just a little bit more complicated because that flow of cash is very different.
Yeah, very different. And it's hard to understand as well.
Yeah.
So on the other side of this, we talked about what's missing, but what are you seeing, I guess, like broadly in terms of like trends that like startups from abroad are bringing to the table that the startups in the US just don't seem to have?
Yeah.
Is there anything?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think, well, there's a couple of different ways to
all right, answer it all the ways.
Okay. Okay. So structurally, I think from the administrative workflow side of the equation, you just have this ability to be able to analyze data that you don't have in the US. So you have a mass of information there, of being able to go through a patient population to be able to understand as to how a certain disease state may manifest itself.
Okay.
That you don't necessarily have. So you have this larger pool that I think is really interesting. Additionally, because of how the regulatory and authoritative bodies are set up in Europe, you don't necessarily have this need to prove effectiveness of a technology. It's proven by the market. And so you have a freedom that is not necessarily very prevalent in the US, where you have many wearable technologies and sensor-based technologies that are getting a chance to launch in Europe first and then come to the US.
Okay.
So actually, most of the technologies within the global army of health transformers that do have that hardware component based outside of the U.S. first. So because they get a chance to play, they get a chance to test. They have the safety, but the effectiveness is decided by the market and how it's actually used, and then they come to the U.S.
Very cool. Okay, so last question for you. Yeah. Just what's happened in startup health-wise? I mean, give us a little bit of a perspective. I mean, you're the academy director, so you're obviously working very closely hand in hand with these startups. Your army is growing. You guys have learned a lot, especially it seems like the last couple years. You guys have really, the momentum of your growth seems to have accelerated. Yeah. So what's new? I mean, give us the last thoughts here on what's new, what's going on, and where you're headed.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to be a part of our growth as an organization as well. I was my very first day, literally my very first day was at the very first workshop that Startup Health held in March of 2012. So that is just to be able to see that transformation. It has been incredible. So in one way, not much has changed, but in another way, we've been able to launch so many new initiatives. So we're going into our 7th year of the Startup Health Festival, which is going to be bigger, better than ever
and that's usually during JP Morgan week every January in San Francisco, which is huge, right? Okay.
Absolutely. So we recently published our 2nd issue of the Startup Health magazine, which is the first magazine that is to focus on health transformation and is meant primarily for a consumer audience. So to be able to tell the stories of all of our health transformers, to be able to share some of the great innovation that is coming up. So the fact that the magazine is out there and is being supported by a suite of media properties has been incredible, and this has been one of our projects for quite some time. So that's been great. And on top of all of that, we just closed our 2nd fund, and
which is exciting.
Yeah,
and how much was the fund?
$31 million fund that was led by incredible suite of partners: Ping On and Guidewell, Novartis, Chiesi, Otsuka, Massimo, just wonderful organizations that aren't just in the U.S. They're global in nature. And that just goes to support our entire global mission to be able to bring this entire community together.
I love it. Thank you so much for joining us. It's always exciting to catch up and hear what's going on. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to speak with you. I'm Jessica DaMassa here at Frontiers Health for WTF Health. Thanks a lot, Polina.